You've heard of child imprisonment before? You've heard of cruelty, of monsters hiding behind smiles? But what you haven't heard, what they never put in the reports, is why. Not the surface-level excuses of mental illness or desperation or madness. No, what happened in that basement wasn't random. It wasn't an isolated case, and it wasn't about money. The 47 children chained in that dark labyrinth beneath the Sullivan farmhouse weren't just victims of abuse. They were products, shaped, conditioned, some for labor, some for submission, and others for darker purposes we're not supposed to speak of on camera. Investigators never found a single financial ledger, no record of ransom, no indication of external buyers, but one document buried in the back of that makeshift medical chamber described a ritual. Not religious, not occult in the Hollywood sense, but methodical, cold, descriptive. It listed behavioral goals for each child: obedient, nonverbal, touch-tolerant, fear-dependent, fully severed identity. These weren't just kidnapped children. They were reprogrammed beings, built for roles no free human would ever accept. Now ask yourself, why go to such lengths? Why engineer silence, obedience, and identity death over years, unless someone was waiting for the final result? It's here, in this moment, that we must stop looking at Constance Sullivan as a lone predator. She wasn't operating in madness. She was following a blueprint, a formula passed down or shared, and that formula has never disappeared. It simply changes address. The deeper you go into suppressed history, the more you realize this wasn't the first Sullivan house. It wasn't the only one. From Pennsylvania to Georgia, from England to Germany, versions of this story bleed into archives, whispered through psychiatric hospitals, orphanage logs, and unsolved disappearances. And yet every time, the pattern is the same. A respected caretaker, a generous woman, a beautiful home hiding a hidden floor. And beneath that floor, the silence of the forgotten. This isn't about horror anymore. It's about design, the weaponization of nurture, the manufacturing of trauma, and the institutions that allowed it to happen. Because sometimes they benefit from broken children. Ready to go deeper? When Sheriff Crawford stepped into that basement, he thought he was walking into a crime scene. What he didn't realize is he was entering a blueprint. Every stone, every chain placement, every dark corner wasn't random. It was intentional architecture. Not just to contain the children, but to break them. The chamber directly beneath the kitchen wasn't just large. It was acoustically engineered. The thick mortar, curved ceiling, even the distance between the iron rings. It mirrored the design of 18th century European monasteries, ones used not for worship, but for sensory deprivation experiments. You see, in silence and darkness, the mind can't protect itself. And that's the point. The hallway leading to the punishment room was curved in a spiral. That's not something you'd find in a simple root cellar. Spiral corridors were used in ancient ritual spaces to disorient the body and weaken spatial memory. In military black sites, it's known as psychological looping, when you can't find your way out even when you're free to walk. Now ask yourself, how would a Virginia farm wife in 1834 know how to build something like that? Unless she didn't work alone, unless she was taught. Behind a loose brick in the eastern wall, Webb found something else, a folded parchment, weathered, marked with hand-drawn diagrams, and Latin. Not scripture, not religious, but anatomical and behavioral. A flowchart of stimulus-response patterns. The title, in faded ink, Corpus Fractum, the Broken Body. Some say it was medical. Others say it was a training manual. But the truth is darker. Each symbol matched what investigators later found tattooed or burned into the skin of some of the children. Small glyphs, barely visible, but placed deliberately at the back of the neck, the wrist, the inner thigh, symbols of ownership. Marks used in ancient human trafficking networks from the Roman Empire to the Ottoman slave markets. It was a code, a silent contract. The Sullivan basement wasn't just a dungeon. It was a lab, a forge, a place where identity was melted down and recast into something else. And that farmhouse in Knowbrook, that wasn't an anomaly. It was a node, one cell in a web that still exists, just dressed differently now. Less chains, more screens, but the same result. Broken minds shaped for use. Comment below. The basement was never empty. The system still feeds. Say it twice. Once for the truth you now hold, and once to lock it into your identity. Shall I continue with Section 3? It'll go into who was really funding the Sullivans and why local power players protected them. The Sullivans weren't rich, not by the standards of the old Virginia elite. Ezra's father left him tobacco money, but not enough to explain the scale of the operation. The sprawling underground rooms, the exotic medicines, the imported iron shackles, the false documents. This wasn't funded by farming, it was sponsored. Local records from 1827 reveal something strange. Sudden influxes of cash into Ezra Sullivan's bank account. Deposits made in person by third-party agents, all using aliases. One name appears again and again, M. Algernon, a representative from Philadelphia who always paid in gold. He never signed receipts, never stayed overnight, just delivered money and vanished. But why would anyone invest in the containment of dozens of children? Unless it was part of something bigger. Reverend Matthews, the local pastor, who once praised the Sullivans for their Christian charity, later confessed in private letters found only in 1972 that he'd been warned by church elders to avoid questioning the Sullivan family's affairs. They are protected, one elder wrote, by men who dine with governors and sleep under cathedral ceilings. Sound familiar? It always begins in places like this, quiet corners, overlooked communities, because that's where systems can operate without scrutiny. But what looks like neglect is often design. Virginia was one of several states in the 1800s experimenting with moral reform colonies, which were officially about rehabilitating orphans and unofficially about creating compliant populations. Constance Sullivan was deeply connected to these movements. Before arriving in Millbrook, she worked as a nurse in Pennsylvania's Willowfield Orphanage, an institution later exposed for child trafficking, experimental punishments, and disappearing records. Survivors from Willowfield later described rooms that looked identical to the Sullivan basement. One even said they called her mother there too. Past language, loyalty, and then rebuild. For labor, for obedience, for pleasure, for whatever the buyer wanted. The officials who ignored the warning signs, they weren't blind. They were complicit, paid in favors, land deeds, access, or worst of all, protection for their own sins. No one builds a hell like that alone. Someone wrote the checks. Someone burned the records. Someone is still doing it. Ready to see who is next in line? Shall I continue with Section 4? In this next part, we'll reveal what the recovered behavioral manuals said and how they tie into modern psychological conditioning systems still used today. They called it a journal, but it wasn't. Among the documents found in the Sullivan basement, there was one book unlike the others. Bound in oil-treated leather, pages made from vellum, not paper. It was hidden behind a false wall panel, kept dry and sealed in wax. Inside, over 300 pages of procedures. Not stories, not confessions, but directives. The first page bore no title, only a single phrase in Latin. Et memoria deleter, anima dissedit. And when memory is erased, the soul departs. Page by page, the book outlined methods for dismantling a child's identity, not through violence alone, but through repetition, deprivation, language control, and reward manipulation. The techniques were clinical, calculated, segmented into stages. Phase 1, isolation and stimulus reduction. Phase 2, pattern disruption and emotional dependency. Phase 3, sensory overload, and pleasure conditioning. Phase 4. Obedience installation and attachment transfer. It read like a twisted hybrid of military field manual and psychological research. But here's where it gets worse. Some of the terminology in that 1834 manuscript matches exactly the language later used in CIA MK-Ultra documents from the 1950s. Obedience fracture, identity neutralization, proxy bonding, amnesia walls. This means one of two things. Either those techniques are much older than we've been told, or someone in the 20th century was inspired by what was already done in places like the Sullivan basement. Now think about this. 47 children, each undergoing these stages simultaneously, without ever being taught their real names, families, or histories. No clocks, no seasons, just training. Some were rewarded with brief contact, touch, warmth, words, but only when they obeyed. Others were punished with silence, cold, or light deprivation. The goal wasn't to beat. The goal was to make them forget they were ever human. This is why, when they were finally rescued, many of the children didn't cry or scream. They simply sat, blinking in confusion, like animals dragged into daylight for the first time. And here's the part no one dares speak aloud. Not all of them wanted to leave, because their minds had been made new, made to fear freedom, made to bond with their captors. This is what happens when the soul is fragmented by design. You don't create survivors. You create ghosts that walk, breathe, obey, but never remember who they were. Want to see where these methods live today, behind different names, in different institutions? Shall I continue with Section 5? In this next descent, we'll follow the trail of institutional mind-breaking from Sullivan to modern systems, from orphan basements to correctional programs, reform schools, and elite boarding academies. They shut the Sullivan House down in 1834, burned it to the ground, buried the records, called it a tragedy, a singular madness. But that's the lie they always tell when a system is caught too early. The truth is, the system didn't end. It simply changed location, and it learned a new language. In the late 1800s, institutions across America began quietly adopting reforms for troubled youth. They called them industrial schools, the form academies, residential behavior programs. Same script, different packaging. The walls got taller, the uniforms cleaner, the words more clinical, but inside, the architecture never changed. Iron rings became locked dormitories. The chains became safety restraints. The isolation chambers were now called reflection rooms. And the manipulation? It was sanctioned, studied, institutionalized. At the Whittingham School for Boys in Illinois, a 1904 inspection revealed children locked in pitch-dark isolation closets for up to 28 days. No windows, no voice, just repetition drills and submission training. In New York's Bedloe Hill Academy, girls were taught that love only came after perfect obedience, and punishment was a necessary proof of care. Sound familiar? From 1834 to 1934, the same techniques from Sullivan's manuscript appear again and again in these institutions. Internal training guides, word for word. The phrase obedience fracture, used in Sullivan's book, appears in a 1922 curriculum titled Advanced Behavior Realignment. And it didn't stop there. By the 1960s, it wore a government badge. MK-Ultra, Project Artichoke, Monarch Programming. A web of mind control experiments on children, prisoners, psychiatric patients, all under the guise of national security. Same phases, same methods, same scars. And in the elite world, it got ritualized. Exclusive boarding schools, leadership camps for high society youth. Behind stone gates, the sons and daughters of judges, senators, and oil barons were put through character building that included sensory deprivation, forced silence, humiliation rituals, the same formula once used to break orphans in a Virginia cellar. They weren't building men. They were building obedience with polish. Ghosts in designer suits. Why? Because a broken mind is easy to mold. And once you've removed identity, you can install anything, Loyalty, lust, rage, submission. This isn't just dark history. It's a system of spiritual conquest, a war for the interior of man. The Sullivan basement wasn't the end. It was the prototype. What they learned there, they still use it. They just wear suits instead of aprons now. Still with me? Shall I take you into Section 6, where we expose the whispers of the love trade underbelly tied to the Sullivan operation? And why some children were marked for purposes darker than death? You would think that once the cellar was broken open, once the chains were cut and the light flooded in, the nightmare would end. But what no one tells you is this. When you shatter a cage, you don't free a bird. You release a ghost. Out of the 47 children recovered from the Sullivan basement, only 31 survived the first year. Malnutrition, disease, and trauma took the rest. But those who lived, they didn't go back to being children. They became something else. The state didn't know what to do with them. There was no recovery program in 1834. No therapy, no legal framework for what had been done to them. So they were handed over to private homes. The very same elite families who had funded the local investigations and charitable efforts. In other words, handed back into the arms of the system. Reports from the 1840s describe sudden behavioral disturbances in households that took in the Sullivan children. Night terrors, self-harm, catatonia, and something more disturbing. Some children would reenact the punishments they had endured. On pets, on siblings, on themselves. One boy, M, was discovered in a family cellar with a dead squirrel tied to a stake, whispering, "Good boys don't run, mother watches." Another girl, E, refused to speak in any language other than the fragmented coded phrases she'd learned underground. Phrases meant to signal obedience, submission, or pain. Psychiatrists wouldn't have the language for this until a century later. Complex trauma conditioning, induced dissociation, identity splitting. But the real horror? Some of these children didn't die. They adapted. They learned to wear faces. Some grew up and married, had jobs, had clearances. A few were even recruited, quietly, into emerging government programs studying behavioral compliance in the 20th century. Let that sink in. Some of the survivors of the Sullivan basement may have gone on to help refine the very techniques used against them, because once the soul is fractured, it can be reassembled into anything. A spy, a priest, a teacher, a handler. Trauma doesn't always break people. Sometimes it builds tools, and some of those tools still walk among us, carrying scars not on their skin, but in the structure of their mind, perfectly shaped to serve and to never ask why. Are you ready to see how these systems were protected for over a century by courts, churches, and even secret legislation? What does a system like this need to survive? Money? Yes. Silence? Always. But more than anything, it needs protection. Not from bullets or mobs, from truth, from light, from justice. And that's where the real machinery reveals itself. After the Sullivan basement was exposed, something strange happened. Within 6 months, all legal records of the investigation were sealed. By whom? A Richmond judge named Francis Delaney, appointed directly by the state governor. Delaney was known for his connections to both the Episcopal Church and the Virginia Landowners Society, a group that at the time operated its own orphan relocation program. That program later linked to over 120 missing children between 1820 and 1845. You starting to see it? This wasn't about one family. It was about an entire legal pipeline protecting elite exploitation under the banner of law, order, and righteousness. The church played its part too. Reverend Matthews, the very man who once praised the Sullivans for their compassion, was reassigned just weeks after the raid. His parish was told he'd taken ill. But letters discovered in 1911 reveal the truth. He was paid off by a private donor, known only as CL, to disappear. One letter reads, "The basement was a breach, yes, but the walls can still be reinforced." The public forgets quickly when led to believe it was an isolated madness. We simply return to the shadows. The work continues. That phrase again. The work continues. And it did. Through secret settlements, judicial orders, clerical silence, institutions designed to erase memory, not preserve it. You think that's over? Consider this. In 1962, during a Senate hearing on institutional abuse, one expert referenced the Sullivan case. The moment he said the name, the room fell quiet. The transcript, later released, shows a redacted section where his comments were struck from record due to unsubstantiated historical myth. He was removed from the panel the next day. But here's what he told a reporter before vanishing. The Sullivan case isn't a myth. It's a manual, one that's been rewritten, republished, and taught, just in different buildings with new uniforms. Law and religion, the twin arms of social control, didn't just fail to stop this system. They built the shell it needed to survive. Still think this is just history? Shall I continue with Section 9, where we unmask the final horror, who Mother Sullivan really was, and the hidden legacy her descendants carried into the 20th century? You've heard of Constance Sullivan, or as the children called her, Mother. But her story wasn't born in Virginia. She didn't just arrive in Millbrook in 1811. She was placed, and she wasn't an ordinary settler's wife. She was part of something older, something passed down like a ritual dagger. We finally understand who she really was because of one overlooked detail. A faded letter found sealed behind a fireplace brick in the Sullivan farmhouse ruins. Addressed to C. Whitlock, dated 1809. It reads, "The child has come of age. Train her to serve the veil. When the house is built, the harvest begins. She remembers the words. She knows the marks. She will raise the dark children in silence. The veil, not a cult, not a religion, a bloodline, traced back to an unbroken female lineage known in coded records as the Black Wives. They moved between nations, always just ahead of scrutiny, posing as midwives, caretakers, Abbey sisters, orphan house directors, and always with access to vulnerable children. Historical whispers place Black Wives at the heart of the Zugarramurdi trials in Spain, the Bathory Orphanage in Transylvania, and the failed children's colony in Massachusetts in 1693. What makes them different? They don't work for power. They carry it as generational keepers of trauma-based obedience programming. Each woman trained the next, from birth, groomed to appear pure, silent, devout, while orchestrating absolute psychological breakdown from behind the curtain. Constance Sullivan wasn't evil by impulse. She was engineered. And she didn't die in prison, as the papers claimed. That's the final lie. Autopsy records from 1835 show the woman buried as Constance Sullivan was a poor farmhand's wife from York County. Her body switched before trial. Meanwhile, a passenger manifest from 1836 lists a C. Whitlock boarding a vessel to Portugal. Next to her name, a young girl, 11 years old. The legacy didn't end. It relocated. And what of that girl? According to Vatican intelligence reports declassified in 2009, a woman known only as Mother Adrian operated a disciplinary school in the Azores from 1847 to 1861. Same punishments, same marks, same methods. The line continued, and it still might be. Some believe the Black Veil Wives never stopped, that today they wear lab coats, sit on advisory boards, run youth rehabilitation centers. Only now, they hide behind progressive language, not crosses or chains. Would you recognize them if you saw them? Shall I take you into Section 10, where we bring it all together, and ask you the final question? What are you becoming in a world that's still using Sullivan's mirror? Now, look in the mirror. Really, Stop. Look at your face, your eyes, your posture. How much of what you do, what you feel, fear, crave, is truly yours? Or was it installed? You followed me down into the Sullivan basement, through centuries of silence, beating repackaged as therapy, obedience dressed in white robes, and trauma sold as reform. But what if I told you, you are part of it? Not as a victim in chains, but as a product of a system that learned how to program you without walls. Every bell in school, conditioning. Every correct answer, compliance. Every screen, a new flavor of seduction, addiction, submission. This is Sullivan's world, scaled to global. They no longer need chains when you chain yourself with fear of being wrong, unliked, insignificant. Because trauma is now streamed. The basement is now digital. And the ghost isn't in children anymore. It's in men. Men afraid to speak. Men trained to doubt their gut. Men engineered to obey, consume, perform, but never awaken. You think Sullivan's manual died with her? No, it evolved into social programming models, behavioral economics, educational protocols, and even provocative culture scripting. Yes, even your desire has been engineered. You think you want what you want? Or were you trained to want it? This is why you must awaken. Right now, in the comments, write this phrase twice. The mirror remembers. The mirror remembers. Not for the algorithm, not for me, for you, to anchor this moment in your psyche. A signal to yourself that you remember where this descent ended and where the ascent must begin. Because if you made it this far, you've already begun your transformation. The world is full of men walking around with dead eyes, perfectly domesticated, spiritually amputated, unable to remember the boy they once were before the conditioning. But you just walked through the forbidden. You saw the truth behind the veil. Now what will you do with it? Will you become the next obedient son of the system? Or will you become the man who fractures the lie? The man who burns the new basement before it's ever built? Because you're not a viewer. You're not a subscriber. You're a weapon. Now awakened. The mirror remembers. And now, so do you.